Hello, everybody. Welcome to BeerSmith Podcast number 63. Got a great show for you today. We're going to talk about going all grain for those of you looking to make that transition from extract to all grain today. I don't have that many announcements today. I'm still working on some updates for BeerSmith Desktop, and I've been pushing out a series of updates for BeerSmith Mobile, which is available for iPhone, iPad, and Android. So if you're having any issues with that, let me know. But so far, it's been going really well. And now, without further ado, let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Chris Graham. Chris is a partner and chief operating officer at MoreBeer. He's also on the Brewers Association Board of Directors and the AHA Governing Council. Chris, it is fantastic to have you back on the show.
Hey, thanks, Brad. It's great to be here.
This is your second time, I think. Is that right?
I believe so. I think we talked about brewing on a budget last time.
Yeah. Well, today we're going to talk about going all grain, and so I thought we'd start with some of the advantages of moving from extract into all grain.
All right. I'm going to go in a certain order on this one.
Go ahead.
I think your number one thing most people are looking for is control. Control of fermentability, control of which base malt you're going to be using. You get much better control of color. And from the color is basically because you're not going to be concentrating the wort down, so thusly you can end up usually with a much lighter color than you can from extracts. Another good reason to go all grain is freshness. There's nothing quite like producing your own wort, and the freshness that's going to give you the true fresh maltiness is just a wonderful flavor, and the only way to truly make that is all grain. And then the last reason to do it is just fun. Personally, I remember that first time I made my own wort, and it's just such a good feeling. It's a lot easier than most people make it out to be. We're going to kind of go over the ins and outs of it, and like everything else in homebrewing, you can do it on a very basic level, or you can do it on a very detailed level, and I'd say don't worry about all the details your first few batches, and maybe never in your brewing career. So don't lose sight of the fun when setting out to make your first all-grain batch.
Yeah, I remember the first time I tried to do it in the kitchen. That was a bit of a mess. I moved it outside shortly after that.
That's half the fun.
Well, the major difference, obviously, in going all grain is you add the mashing step. So can we talk about what the mashing process is and what that looks like?
So, mashing itself is, in simplicity, it's converting starches to sugars and then separating the sugars from the solids to go into the boil kettle. So that's the basics to what you're going to do. Essentially, you're going to put grain and water together at the right hydration level in a particular pH range and hold the temperature to build an environment where the enzymes convert starches to sugars. And I'll say, for simplicity's sake, you could usually take the pH factor out of it for your first batches and just say, hey, I've got to hold a temperature between 148 and 158 for an hour, roughly, at 1 quart of water per pound of grain. And that can vary, and we'll go over a little bit more of that in detail further on. But that's all you have to do is hold that temperature at the right hydration, and the enzymes that are naturally in your malt will do the conversion for you.
Well, so that leads us into our next question, which is what's actually going on in the mash? What are some of the enzymes that are at work there, and what's happening?
All right. Well, basically, the enzymes are there usually to break down chemical elements into smaller pieces. There are 7 enzymes that release during the mash at different temperatures. The top 2 that we should really talk about are alpha amylase and beta amylase. And when really thinking about the beers that your audience and us, quite frankly, are usually drinking from local craft breweries, they're doing single infusion mashes, and we'll cover that in a minute. But really, that means they're probably going through one of the 2 of these, depending on the temp range they're in. Most likely going through alpha amylase, which is 154 to 162 degrees Fahrenheit in temperature, and it produces a variety of sugars, but mostly maltose. And it really, think of it as you got a chain of sugars. and it cleaves them in half or towards the middle, breaking them down quicker. Where beta amylase, which you do at a lower temperature, 131 to 150, only produces maltose, but it essentially, if you have your strain of sugar, it nips away at the end as opposed to cleaving them in half, so it takes a longer time to do. Essentially, that really leads into the different temperatures is what's going to get us different degrees of fermentability. Beta amylase is going to give you a very high degree of fermentability, where alpha amylase leaves behind some starches and such on the sugars and will give you a lower degree of fermentability.
So that affects the body of the beer, right?
The body of the beer, how much malt is left over. So think of it this way: in your your single fusion mash, 148 to 158, the lower you go, the higher the fermentability. The higher you go, the lower the fermentability.
So if I mash in at a low temperature, I'm going to get a beer that's more fermentable or has less body, right?
Exactly. So if you're looking for a big malty beer, you're probably going to want to go on the warmer side. If you're looking for a dry beer that maybe the hops are going to be the dominant
with
factor
a clean finish, yeah,
you're going to go for that lower temperature. But essentially, I like for beginner all grain brewers to just think 148 to 158, and then be safe. Try to go maybe more for 150 to 156, because if you miss your temp by a few degrees, you'll still be in the safe zone as opposed to going all the way extreme.
Right, and then you won't have to adjust it.
Exactly.
Well, a lot of people are afraid of the extra equipment involved in going all grain. What equipment do you actually need to go to an all grain brew versus an extract brew? What do you have to go out and buy?
Well, unfortunately, Brad, you need to spend about $10,000.
$10,000, yeah.
Well, no, just kidding. So
you guys sell some of those, I know.
Of course.
Some of those nice systems.
The real spectrum of traditional all grain brewing, we'll talk about something that's a little untraditional later on, but traditional all grain brewing is usually having 3 vessels. You have your boil kettle, which you probably already have, your mash tun, which is essentially a container that has a false bottom in it, and a hot liquor tank, which is essentially just a vessel to hold hot water that's going to be used for sparging. So you can get away with, my first all grain was 2 buckets with holes drilled underneath one bucket and a spigot in the other one to make essentially a false bottom, and that became my hot liquor tank, or my mash tun. A different bucket was my hot liquor tank, and I just had my boil kettle and Camp Chef cooker, which I already had. So that's a very inexpensive way. You're talking, if you already have a full volume boil setup, a kettle, a wort chiller, and a burner, you're probably adding $20 to $30 more by doing it that way. You can go to coolers, which will hold your temperatures better, and you're probably talking, $200 to $300. You can go to stainless vessels that you can then add heat underneath, weld onto, do a lot of variety of options. You're probably talking $500 to $600 worth of equipment extra, or you can buy full all grain setups ready to go, anywhere from $2,000 to $8,000.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, for somebody just starting out, though, really all you need is a large pot, right? To do that full boil.
I was going to say that's a prerequisite, is that you need to have a full boil capacity. So if you're going to brew 5-gallon batches, you need a minimum of 7.5-gallon kettle, if not bigger.
Right.
And if you have that size kettle, you will also need a wort chiller for after the boil to cool your wort down quicker.
Right. That makes sense. So you need a large kettle. A wort chiller is ideal, probably some kind of an immersion chiller, which you can actually make yourself. And then a mash tun of some kind, right?
Correct.
Which could be a 5-gallon got cooler, like a big water cooler, for example.
It could be got coolers. It could be literally just food grade buckets. You can buy false bottoms for them now, or you could make your own by taking one bucket and drilling a series of holes in the bottom and nesting it inside the other bucket.
Good.
That was my very first all grain setup. Granted, I only brewed twice with it because it was a pain to clean, but it did work.
No, I did the same thing. This was many years ago, but my very first time I used a couple buckets just like that. Well, let's talk for a minute about infusion mashing and what that is. I know you've used the term already, but talk about what's an infusion mash and how you actually do it.
Well, we talked about a single infusion mash, which is one type of infusion mash. So infusion mash generally means basically holding a temperature for X amount of time to bring the right environment for the enzymes to convert starches to sugar.
So infusion's actually adding water, though, right?
It can be adding water. I think that's the initial base of it. And then it can be just raising the temperature up through the different enzyme steps to release different enzymes depending on what you're trying to achieve. So the most common one is a single infusion mash, which is literally one infusion of water. It's what most craft breweries do in the United States. It's what most homebrewers do in the United States, and it's quite successful. Grains these days are so well modified that the need for multiple step mashing is drastically reduced.
Right.
So single infusion, we talked about it earlier, 148 to 158 degrees works beautifully.
So obviously, so you heat up some water, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you don't heat the water up to 150 degrees, right?
So let's say we're going to want to hit 150 degrees. We would heat up our water. We'd use some great software. I'm trying to think of what a good software
I have no idea.
Maybe BeerSmith.
Yeah.
And it can help you calculate an estimate of what that strike water should be. So if my grains are sitting at 70 degrees in my house and I have, let's say, 12 pounds and I'm going to brew a 5-gallon batch with it, and it will tell me how much water I should have in there and what temperature I should bring that water to be able to, once I dough in, meaning stir the grains into the water, get them evenly distributed. That's usually a 2 to 3 minute, up to 5 to 7 minute process to get all the water evenly, or the grains evenly distributed in the water. That's going to have a temperature drop. So we might have started with 163 degree water, but ended up after stirring in with 150 degree mash. Then we're going to try to hold that mash for a certain amount of time. Usually a minimum of 45 minutes is what most people do. I usually shoot more for an hour. And depending on which style of mashing I'm going to do, to if I hold that one temp for 45 minutes or an hour.
Okay, so you walked us through the basic infusion process. We add some hot water to our grains, right? We mix them up, try and hold them at that temperature for, say, an hour or so. What's the next step, though? Where do you go next?
We're going to sparge.
Right.
And all sparging really means is rinsing the grains and collecting the sugar in the boil kettle. So typically we're going to go through a sparge of 45 minutes to an hour. I find a law of diminishing returns on my own brewing is roughly 45 minutes. And so and this is called fly sparging, and I'm going to typically just try to match my flow of water into my mash tun and my flow of water out of my mash tun into my boil kettle to be about the same rate, usually trying to keep a base of water over the top of my grain bed of 1 to 2 inches.
Right. You want to keep the grain bed kind of floating there, right? You don't want to, if you let it sink, it kind of jams up, doesn't it?
Exactly. We're not trying to compact the grain bed. We're trying to keep it floating.
Right. So
yet we want the grain bed set enough so that it's acting as a filtering process during the sparge. So the little bits of grain will come through, and the husks set up a filter bed. And before we even start collecting in our boil kettle, usually we'll boil off, meaning we'll use a pitcher or something that's safe to handle hot liquid with. We'll pull out from underneath the false bottom of the mash tun, collect it in that vessel, and pour it back on top of the mash itself a few times until we start noticing less and less bits of grist in the wort itself.
Right, because when you run those first, we call it the first runnings, but when you run that first bit of stuff out, it typically has a lot of grain large grain particles in it, right?
Exactly.
Until the filter bed kind of sets up, and then it all works well.
Exactly. And so, and even depending on what kind of false bottom you've made, to how much of that little grist you'll hold back immediately. So it takes one or two passes through the mash tun itself, the liquid, before they really start holding back 99% of the solids.
Right. We didn't cover well, but a mash tun typically has a false bottom in it as well. And even if you use a got cooler, water cooler, or something like that, you typically go buy some kind of a false bottom to put in it, right?
Stainless false bottoms have become kind of the norm nowadays, but you can also make your own. There's all kinds of podcasts and websites on making slotted copper false bottoms, things like that.
Or drilling holes in the bottom of a bucket, like we talked about earlier. There's a lot of ways to do it, yeah.
Or spending hours drilling tiny little holes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, a conversion process usually takes, you mentioned, maybe up to an hour. And how do you really maintain the temperature there? So
what's interesting is actually, if you read most malt analysis, and maybe this is getting a little too technical, but you read most malt analysis, conversion is usually 5 to 7 minutes. However, separating the sugars from the solids is what takes roughly an hour.
Yeah.
So the reason I mention that is the temperature is critical for those first 5 to 7 minutes to really set what enzyme is doing the conversion for you. Then keeping it warm is what's going to make it more soluble to lower the viscosity to get the sugar out of the solids. The mash itself is an insulation, and by itself will help keep your temperatures. If you're at room temperatures of, say, 68 to 75, it's amazing how well, even in a bucket, that mash won't change a whole lot of temperature in that room temperature type environment. Now, if you're in Fargo in the middle of winter, sure, you're going to have quite a bit of a temp drop, and you might want to insulate the system a little bit with just a foam insulation, or you can build your own type of devices from herms or rims to help maintain that temperature.
A lot of us use we talked about it already, but a lot of us use an insulated cooler. Another trick I've used, just wrap a blanket around it too.
It can be ultra simple. If you're doing the buckets like we described earlier, a towel or blanket is probably totally fine to keep you. And if you drop 7 or 8 degrees throughout an hour, that's totally fine, because remember, the enzyme conversion is what you care about most from a flavor profile, and that happens fairly quickly.
Yeah. Well, how do we actually tell when we're done? How do we tell when the sugar conversion is actually complete?
So you're talking to a colorblind guy, and so I used to try these iodine tests, and I could never see the conversion.
You couldn't see the color, huh?
But generally, most people in the beginning of their all grain career, they'll go to any kind of place, pharmacy, CVS, Longs, those types of places, and you can buy iodine there.
Right. And they sell it for first aid, right?
Exactly. And you can run a very simple iodine starch test.
And how does that work?
But you must be able to see color.
Ah.
And so thusly, it failed for me. I rarely ever even think to do this anymore, and I do it more by taste than anything else, because most of us can taste sugar. And so I recommend during your mashing process, try a little bit of the liquid in the beginning of the mash, midway through the mash, and at the end of the mash, and you'll completely notice the difference of flavors. In the beginning, it might taste like steeped oats, oatmeal, that type of stuff, where in the middle, you'll start picking up more mouthfeel and some more sugars, and by the end, it should taste very sweet relative to what it tasted in the beginning. But to run a iodine test, you usually use a white plate. Mm-hmm. You'll pull a few drops of your liquid out of your mash, and you'll and now this is the part I forget, Brad, because I haven't done it in so long.
Put a couple drops of iodine in, right?
Do you do the iodine first or the iodine second? That's the part I forget.
I think it goes either way. You just put the iodine in it, and it typically changes color, right?
Changes color in the presence of starches.
That's right.
And so if you don't have starches, it won't change color. If you do, it'll change color.
Right. Exactly.
Barring you can see color.
Okay, so we walked through the sparging and lautering process, and now we basically boil the wort with the hops, right?
Exactly. And if you're doing a full volume boil already, nothing else really changes from this part forward.
But why do we need a full volume boil for an all grain? I mean, why do we need to go buy that bigger pot?
Because we are going to not be using a concentrate of our sugars. We are going to be using the grain, converting the starches to sugars, and rinsing them out. That's not going to get us a highly concentrated sugar to start with. So in order to do a partial boil, usually you're dealing with a high sugar content and then topping up with water, diluting at the end to get you to your original gravity that you're trying to hit per that recipe. When doing all grain, you don't get that luxury of being able to top up at the end in the volumes of 2 to 3 gallons to get you the gravity. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't use software such as BeerSmith to help you with your pre-volume boil to help either add water or add some sort of concentrated sugar, whether that be corn sugar, DME, liquid malt extract, to help adjust your gravity to get it online with what your target's going to be at the end of the boil.
Right, right. But you really do need a full boil to do an all grain properly, right?
There is no choice. You would end up with very weak beers for the most part if you tried to do a concentrated boil and top up with water. Yeah,
you'd have a pretty narrow beer, pretty thin beer.
It'd be very session beer.
Yeah. And I guess, it's kind of important to understand that when you buy an extract from the store, they've gone through this. The guys that created the extract went through the same process already, right?
Correct. And that's the cool part about doing it yourself. You're doing what's been done for you, but you're not going through a concentration process afterwards before it's your wort in your kettle. And that is what's going to give you the fresher flavors, the better control of color, and to be honest, the full control of the recipe. There are so many great base malts out there, and depending on what beer you're trying to make, if you're trying to make an English-style pale ale, having a floor malted Maris Otter grain, it makes a totally different flavor than a basic Canadian or U.S.-grown two-row, which is perfect for your IPAs that the malt is not your base profile. And then even in your U.S.-grown two-row, you have all these different brands who treat the grains differently in the malting process, thusly giving you different flavors. So it really opens up a world of flavors that you can control once you go all grain.
Yeah, I think one of the things a lot of people don't realize, too, is when they go through this process, they go through the same mashing process we just described when they create an extract, but then they have to concentrate it down by heating it up. And when they do that,
usually go through a heat and vacuum process.
Heat and vacuum, they heat it up under a vacuum to create the extract that comes in the can or whatever.
Which definitely alters it.
What I was going to say is when they do that, it makes it much darker.
Correct.
And in fact, also because of that process, that concentration process, it actually gets darker over time as it's sitting on the shelf too in your homebrew store. So it becomes very difficult to brew some very light beers like Kolsch and a number of others with extract because you just can't get the extract light enough as a base to start.
Yeah, not only can you not get the extract light enough, you also usually don't get the choice of the base malt. So if you're making a Kolsch versus a Munich Helles,
right,
you're kind of stuck probably when you're doing extract with one base malt, where when you go all grain, you'll get a myriad of choices.
Yeah, you go to that Pilsner or whatever you need, the real light Pilsner malt, for example.
Exactly.
Well, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about one alternative, which is brew in a bag, which is kind of a neat idea out of Australia. It uses a mesh bag instead of using a mash tun, and it saves a little bit of money. I was wondering if you could talk for a minute about brew in a bag.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting way of doing it, and essentially all you need, if you are already a extract brewer and you already have a large kettle, all you need is a mesh bag system that is roughly 75% the size of your kettle or bigger, that you'd be able to remove out of the kettle safely. That's a key, to be able to do your mash inside of. So essentially the concept is, instead of having a mash tun, we're going to make a bag that is our lauter, and lauter is simply the separation of the grain and the liquid, that we will pull out of the kettle. Instead of draining the liquid through the kettle, we're just going to pull the bag out.
So essentially, you're mashing in you're mashing in the kettle, the same kettle you're going to boil in.
Exactly.
And then when you're done mashing, you just lift the grain bag out, right?
You lift the grain bag out, and I highly recommend, before you do it for the first time, the internet's a great source. I don't know if you've done a podcast on it specifically.
I did one. It's probably a year and a half ago now, but I did one with actually a gentleman from Australia on brewing a bag, and I've done a couple articles on it as well. There's a lot of information out there. There's even websites that are dedicated specifically to brewing a bag. Exactly,
and that's what I recommend you do as a first-time person to do it, because a couple things you want to take in consideration. One, you got to learn to make your recipes around it, because it's not going to be as efficient as a mash and a sparge. Also, and that's no big deal because grain is very inexpensive. Also, though, you want to make sure you put some effort into building the bag properly so that you don't end up with issues when you go to remove the bag from the kettle, because as we hear a lot of people doing it as customers, and that's the number one thing they say, that they wish they'd spent more time initially setting up and doing a practice of getting the bag out, because that can be the complicated part. That's the only complicated part of the whole process, because as soon as you remove that bag, then you're in your regular boil and all the normal things.
Yeah, I recommend gloves when you're doing that.
See, there's all these.
I've done it a couple of times, yeah.
All these little different nuances, and we sell a large bag. It's 24 by 24, which a lot of people use for it. But in and of itself, that bag was made for adding hops into large fermenters for breweries. It's not really reinforced to be able to pick up 12, 15 pounds of grain with.
Yeah.
So you'll want to reinforce it a bit before you use something like that.
Well, for a 5-gallon batch, though, it's very practical, because you're typically got, maybe 10 pounds of grain or something like that. Not that bad.
Exactly.
But yeah, as you get larger, it becomes a little more difficult. You got to start worrying about those kinds of things. But I think it's a great cheap alternative, because you can start with your extract brewing set, add a large pot and a burner, and be up and running, relatively cheaply.
We've got 2 customers who are doing that now, and 2 that I talk to on a regular basis. Yeah. And what they've also done is, in their boil kettle, they spent some extra money to get a false bottom that has about 1.5 inch legs on it. And we sell that standardly with most of our kettles. And what that does is allow them to actually go through step mashing if they want to as well, by heating the water underneath it and doing a lot of stirring. So it opens up not just the ability to do a single infusion, but actually to do step mashes down the road if you want. You can, yeah, absolutely. In fact, you can do anything with brewing a bag than you can with a regular mash setup, it turns out. Yep.
Well, I thought we'd wind up with do you have any advice for those just starting their first all-grain brew?
Well, it wouldn't be a good podcast if I didn't quote Charlie Papazian and say, relax, don't worry, have a homebrew. Yeah. But to be quite honest, that is not my style. I love the hobby. I love being precise about it when I am doing my own brewing. So generally, I don't drink a whole lot while I'm brewing, if any, so that I can make very repeatable batches and that kind of stuff.
See, now I have a tradition. I always drink a beer from my last batch when I create the new batch.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. Well, assuming it's ready.
Yeah. Or assuming you didn't run out of your old batch.
Yeah, well, that too.
But basically, don't sweat all the stuff that you can. You're going to read a lot about all these different things of over-sparging and pH levels and tannins and a lot of things that you can really get involved in when it comes to all grain. But for the most part, find a place you trust. Get a recipe from there that's been brewed before.
Sure.
And just worry about very simple things. Getting the temperature right, holding it for that amount of time. And as you progress, don't add too much at once. This is, this opens a whole new door once you go all grain to all kinds of fun stuff that you can do. And I see a lot of people, they start listening to podcasts, they start reading books when they go all grain, and they really learn, oh my goodness, I can do all these things. And some people think you have to be an expert at chemistry, pH, bioengineering, all this crazy stuff, where really you can do it in a cooler without a thermometer built in, and you can actually make great beer. I'm going to add one more thing. So you're brewing that first all grain batch. Just relax a bit, taste it along the way. You're not going to hurt anything of tasting your wort before you boil, and you will know that you are converting those starches to sugars. So yes, you can go out and buy some iodine and do your test, or you can simply taste it and know that you've done a proper job.
Well, thanks, Chris. I did want to ask you one more thing. I know you got a big announcement, which is MoreBeer's you've been heavily involved in an expansion here. I thought maybe I'd give you just a minute to talk about that.
Well, thanks. I actually want to add one more
go ahead.
bit
I'm
of
sorry.
advice for brewing before we move on, and that is, you're doing this whole thing that's going to give you so much more control of your flavor. And I happen to teach for a brewing school, and I just happened to do it a couple weeks ago. And one of the things I think a lot of people lose sight of, fermentation is in terms of adding the right amount of yeast and holding the right temperature. And if you're going all grain, please know that you need to have that fermentation under control before these types of changes are going to make a huge effect on your flavor of your beer.
So fermentation, really important.
Fermentation, especially temperature. So all of this stuff we're doing here isn't very important if you don't have that under control yet.
Yeah.
And so leading into fun projects, MoreBeer has been a fun endeavor for the last, 18 years now. And we started out of the back of my business partner's house, and we've slowly but surely, we keep buying up our neighborhood of industrial complexes here in Concord, California. And we did our first huge expansion, which was to build a 30,000 square foot, fully dedicated to distribution in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And the whole goal is to serve our customers faster.
Right.
It's been a huge project. We rebuilt our website to handle looking at our inventory in the two warehouses and directing your orders to go into the correct warehouse. We put a whole dedicated staff into fulfilling your orders in Pennsylvania. So wherever you live in the country, we can service you in 3 days, and 88% of our customers will service in 2 days or less, getting from when we ship it to your house. In doing this project, we've also sped up our ship times, not only from what FedEx takes to get to your house, but from when it leaves our door. Our free shipping policy, most orders over $59 ship for free to the contiguous 48 states. And so our shipping times used to be 3 to 4 days of when they leave the door to go out to you. We've cut that down to 1 to 2, and in a lot of cases, 1 or less to get out the door. So not only getting the orders out the door faster, but getting to your house faster.
Well, fantastic, Chris. Thank you. Then again, the website, just want to put it in here.
MoreBeer.com.
MoreBeer.com. That's what I thought. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add, Chris?
No, thank you for what you do for the industry, Brad. We appreciate it. We love your software. I've been referring more and more people to listen to your podcast. Brad has a new book. You should check that out. See, I'm giving you plugs as well.
Well, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. Well, again, today, my guest has been Chris Graham from MoreBeer. He's a partner and also chief operating officer at MoreBeer. He's also been very active in the Brewing Association. He's on the Brewing Association Board of Directors and the AHA Governing Council. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Brad. Have a good one.
Well, a big thank you to Chris Graham for appearing on the show. I really appreciate him being here. A reminder to you, if you're not signed up for our newsletter, you can go to BeerSmith.com and click on the little newsletter link on the right side, and we'll send you an article on homebrewing every single week. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.